Ah, yes, it's time to sit back and begin our story. Now I'm going to take you far away, thousands of years back, to the lands of Al-Andalus. These lands were where ancient civilizations met, cultures blended, and one of the greatest empires in history once stood. But this story is not just about conquest or a fight for power. It's also a tale of survival, of exiles, kings, and the epic events that changed the fate of nations and peoples. Close your eyes and imagine setting out from the Arabian Peninsula, crossing the foaming waters of the Mediterranean, and arriving at the far western edge, Al-Andalus. It's the mid-8th century. The Islamic world is in turmoil. On one side, the Abbasids, and on the other, the Umayyads are locked in a fierce struggle for power. And this battle will lead to one of the most extraordinary escapes in history. Now picture this: a young prince, Abd al-Rahman, fleeing deep into the desert as his family members are killed one by one. With the Abbasids' revenge burning everywhere, Rahman's destiny awaits him in Al-Andalus. At this point, Al-Andalus is a crossroads of different cultures and beliefs: Christians, Jews, Berbers, and Arabs like Aisha. But establishing order in these lands won't be easy for Abd al-Rahman. My friends, this is where our story begins. Gather around the fire and get ready to hear this magnificent saga. I will guide you step by step through Rahman's transformation from a fugitive to a ruler, and how he turned Al-Andalus into one of the most important centers of culture and learning in the Islamic world. As we wander through the mysterious valleys of Al-Andalus, we will find a story at every corner. Beneath every stone lies a piece of history. And here we are today, ready to delve into the depths of these lands that still echo with the voices of people who lived 1,000 years ago. But if you're ready, let's begin our story. Now let's go back to one of the darkest and most complicated periods in history. The Islamic world is in the grip of a raging storm. The Abbasids and Umayyads are locked in a fierce struggle for the throne and power. Both sides are ready to do whatever it takes to claim that enchanted seat of authority. And right in the middle of this bloody conflict, a young prince's epic escape begins: Abd al-Rahman. By the year 750, the Abbasids deliver a blow that will change the course of history. Up until that point, the Umayyads had been the most powerful dynasty in the Islamic world, but they are suddenly overthrown. The Abbasids launch a relentless hunt to wipe out the Umayyad family. And just imagine closing your eyes and traveling back to that time, a young prince fleeing in terror through a bloody night. Abd al-Rahman, as his family is slaughtered one by one, he is the sole survivor. With the Abbasids' fury and ruthless ambition to erase the Umayyad bloodline, Abd al-Rahman is fighting just to stay alive. Abd al-Rahman's escape is no ordinary flight. As he crosses the deserts of North Africa, it's the alliances he builds with Berber tribes, along with his intelligence and courage, that keep him alive. This journey, lasting days and weeks, both strengthens him physically and sharpens his mind. At every step, every cave he hides in, one thought dominates his mind: revenge and the dream of restoring the lost Umayyad honor. By 755, Abd al-Rahman arrives in Al-Andalus. At that time, Al-Andalus sits on the far western edge of the Islamic world, dominated by Berber and Arab tribes. But even here, there is no stability. The region is torn by constant tribal conflict and power struggles. Yet when Abd al-Rahman sets foot in Al-Andalus, the chaos begins to work in his favor. He's not just a fugitive, he's a ruler in waiting, filled with the vision of rebuilding the empire he lost. Once in Al-Andalus, Abd al-Rahman wastes no time gathering his strength. Through cunning, diplomacy, and military genius, he forms alliances with the local tribes, spotting weaknesses and turning them to his advantage. He wins over the Berber tribes while also gaining the support of Arab nobles. For Abd al-Rahman, Al-Andalus is a fresh start. Here he will revive the Umayyad bloodline, free from the Abbasids' cruel grasp, and breathe the life back into an empire. Gradually, Abd al-Rahman consolidates his power. He ends the tribal wars and unites the lands of Al-Andalus. His talent extends far beyond that of a warrior. He proves to be a remarkable statesman as well, and so begins the golden era of Al-Andalus. Abd al-Rahman not only survives the Abbasids' wrath, but he also establishes a new Umayyad dynasty, changing the course of history. What was once a fallen empire finds new life in the lands of Al-Andalus. This is not just a tale of survival, it's a story of resurrection. Abd al-Rahman was not simply a man running from the ghosts of his past. He became a visionary who reshaped the flow of history. The new Umayyad state in Al-Andalus would leave its mark not only on the Islamic world but also on Europe. From this point forward, Al-Andalus would open the doors to a golden age of science, art, and architecture. Can you feel the enchanting air of Andalusia? Those endless plains, winding rivers, and deep valleys nestled between the mountains, but beneath this beauty lies a vast battleground. With the arrival of al-Rahman, Andalusia entered a new era, though it wasn't a peaceful one. Instead, it was a time of chaos filled with political and military struggles and internal rebellions, and al-Rahman found himself in the midst of it, fighting to establish the Umayyad state in Andalusia. The days when al-Rahman gathered his strength were not just about escaping the Abbasids, but also about battling local tribes, nobles, and rebels in Alzia. The region was teeming with Berber and Arab tribes, frequently caught in internal conflicts. Establishing centralized control in this far western corner of the Islamic world was no easy feat. Every tribe looked out for its own interests, and every leader fought to secure their own dominance. But al-Rahman wasn't just a warrior, he was a brilliant strategist. His sharp mind was exactly what was needed to untangle this complex political knot. The divisions between the tribes in Andalusia ran deep. The old rivalry between the Berbers and the Arabs was still fresh. The Berber tribes in particular were unhappy with the dominance of the Arab nobility. This tension was one of the first issues al-Rahman recognized. He knew that trying to build a state while simultaneously battling these tribes would be nearly impossible. His diplomatic skills came into play here. He met with the leaders of the Berber tribes individually, bringing them over to his side. His promises, respect, and fair treatment calmed the Berber population. But this was just the beginning. The Arab nobles were unsettled by al-Rahman's rise. To them, he was an outsider, a young leader who had fled from Syria, now attempting to establish authority on their lands. These nobles wanted to preserve their own power and resisted the idea of a centralized state. This is where al-Rahman's military genius shined. He marched against the Arab nobles who opposed him, employing every military strategy available to crush their rebellions. However, these conflicts weren't easy victories. Every battle soaked Andalusian soil with blood. The internal rebellions in Andalusia weren't limited to the Arab nobles. Local governors led uprisings in an attempt to preserve the old order. al-Rahman had to confront each of these revolts one by one. One of his greatest victories was quelling the rebellion in Seville. At the time, Seville was one of the largest cities in Andalusia, and the rebellion there posed a threat to the entire region. But al-Rahman rallied his troops, besieged the city, and after days of fierce fighting, managed to bring Seville under control. This victory solidified his authority in Andalusia and sent a powerful message to other rebels. al-Rahman didn't just unify Andalusia through military victories, but also through his political skills. Under his leadership, a centralized state structure was established. He maintained a delicate balance between the Arab nobles and the Berber tribes, winning support from both sides. Additionally, he had to remain vigilant against the Abbasid threat. The Abbasid Caliphate sought to overthrow al-Rahman at every opportunity, sending agents into Andalusia to stir up rebellions. Yet al-Rahman not only quelled these internal revolts but also defended Andalusia from external threats, building a strong state in the process. After years of rebellion and external threats, Andalusia was now under al-Rahman's control. He was no longer just a fugitive, he had gone down in history as a great statesman. The foundations of the state were laid, the rebellions crushed, and Andalusia had become the new center of the Umayyad dynasty. al-Rahman etched his name into history as both a conqueror and a founder. During this time, the seeds of peace and prosperity were sown in Andalusia. Science, art, and architecture began to flourish in this land. al-Rahman didn't just build a state, he left behind a legacy that would transform Andalusia into one of the most important cultural centers in the Islamic world. Without his determination, intellect, and courage, Andalusian history might have taken an entirely different course. The ancient lands of the Iberian Peninsula, with its winding rivers, endless coastlines stretching toward the sea, and towering mountains, it truly captivates the soul. For centuries, these lands were the stage for kings, armies, and great civilizations vying for control. But by the year 711, this ancient territory had reached a turning point. That year, one of the most daring commanders of the Islamic world, Tariq ibn Ziyad, embarked on a mission that would etch his name into the annals of history, the conquest of the Iberian Peninsula. Tariq ibn Ziyad, his name echoed through the ages. He was a young commander of the Umayyad army, But he was more than just a soldier. With his strategic brilliance, courage, and foresight, he became one of the most significant figures in Islamic history. In 711, he set out from the Maghreb region of North Africa, leading an expedition that would open the doors of the Iberian Peninsula to the Islamic world. But this wasn't just a military campaign. It was a monumental event that laid the foundation for a civilization that would endure for centuries. At the time, the Iberian Peninsula was under the rule of the Visigoths. But the Visigoth kingdom had lost its former glory, weakened by internal strife and struggles for the throne. The kingdom was led by King Roderick, but his reign was far from stable. Noble families in the church were locked in fierce competition, and under Roderick's weak leadership, the Visigoths had lost the strong army they once commanded. The people were restless, rebellions were breaking out, and the government could no longer maintain control over the vast territories. This political chaos was the perfect opportunity for Tariq ibn Ziyad. The Umayyad Caliphate saw this internal turmoil as a chance to extend its reach into the Iberian Peninsula, but the decision to invade was not made lightly in Damascus, the heart of the Umayyad Caliphate. The conquest would require immense courage and strategic planning. Finally, the suggestion of Musa ibn Nusayr, the governor of North Africa, was accepted. After the Islamic army's success in the Maghreb, Musa believed it was possible to push further north and conquer the Iberian Peninsula. Like Tariq, Musa was a visionary leader who saw the great benefits this conquest could bring to the Islamic world. Musa ibn Nusayr needed a young, determined leader to command the expedition, and Tariq ibn Ziyad was that man. Not only was he skilled in military tactics, but his leadership abilities set him apart. As his troops set out from the Maghreb, they knew they were on the brink of a great change. When Tariq crossed the Strait of Gibraltar with around 7,000 men, a new door opened between the Islamic world and Christian Europe. It was at this moment that the famous burning of the ships incident took place. Tariq ibn Ziyad delivered a speech to his soldiers that would change the course of history. After crossing the strait, he ordered all the ships to be burned, cutting off any chance of retreat. The message was clear: they would either win or die on these lands. Tariq's unforgettable words rang out: "The enemy is in front of you, and the sea is behind you. There is no going back. We will either conquer or we will die." It was a powerful display of courage and determination, inspiring his army to fight with everything they had. The Visigoths were caught off guard by this small but determined force. Roderick tried to stop Tariq's dauntless advance, but the internal strife within his kingdom and the disorder in his army proved to be significant disadvantages. Both armies cautiously approached the decisive battle at the banks of the Guadalete River. But for the Visigoth kingdom, the battle ended in disaster. Tariq ibn Ziyad, with his bold and swift maneuvers, utterly crushed the Visigoth army. Roderick's forces were defeated, marking the end of the Visigoth kingdom. This victory was more than just a military success. It signaled the entry of Islamic civilization into the western edge of Europe. A new era began in Al-Andalus. But this new chapter was not just shaped by Tariq's military triumphs, it was also the result of his visionary leadership. Under his command, a new Islamic state would be established on the Iberian Peninsula, and these lands would remain under Umayyad control for a time. The arrival of Tariq ibn Ziyad on the Iberian Peninsula marked the beginning of the Umayyad era in Al-Andalus. But this was only the start of a long and difficult journey filled with struggles. With the fall of the Visigoths, the Iberian Peninsula would never be the same. Islamic civilization began to take root in these lands. Tariq ibn Ziyad's leadership sparked a cultural and political revolution here, and so the history of Al-Andalus began to unfold. Under Tariq ibn Ziyad's leadership, the Islamic army stepped onto the Iberian Peninsula in triumph, and the foundations of a great civilization were laid at the western edge of the Umayyad Empire. But this was only the beginning. There were many more struggles, victories, and challenges to come. The history of Al-Andalus was shaped by the first steps of this brave leader. But remember, there are still many stories to be told from these lands. The history of the Umayyads and Al-Andalus had one of its most crucial turning points in their struggle to survive and expand while facing both internal and external threats. On one hand, they needed to suppress the simmering rebellions within the state, while on the other they had to deal with outside threats. This was certainly not an easy process. Yet the Umayyad commanders who emerged on the historical scene managed to overcome these threats with clever strategies, diplomatic maneuvers, and strong armies. From the very beginning, the Umayyad state in Al-Andalus faced a series of uprisings. These rebellions stemmed from local powers that did not remain loyal to the Umayyad dynasty, tribal conflicts, and rivalries within the Arab aristocracy. While power struggles among Arab tribes continued, local populations in the region, especially the Berbers, occasionally revolted due to their desire for independence. However, the state's founder, Abd al-Rahman I, skillfully fought against each of these uprisings. His determination and strategic brilliance allowed the Umayyads to suppress internal threats one by one. Even when Abd al-Rahman negotiated with the rebellious elements to strengthen loyalty to the state, he never showed weakness. Thanks to his strong leadership, internal turmoil eventually came to an end, and state unity was achieved. However, suppressing the internal rebellions was just the closing of one chapter. The external threats were much more complicated, and perhaps the biggest enemy the Umayyads faced was the Frankish kingdom to the north. At that time, the Frankish kingdom was led by Charlemagne, known as the Great. His armies were among the most powerful military forces in Western Europe, and he was known to have set his sights on the Iberian Peninsula. The Umayyads were caught between trying to control the internal chaos and facing the Frankish threat from the north. It was at this point that Abd al-Rahman I and his successors began planning a major offensive against the Frankish kingdom, not content to just remain on the defensive. The dream of expanding from the south of Al-Andalus to the north of the Pyrenees occupied the minds of the Umayyad leaders. The Pyrenees were of great strategic and geographical importance as a natural border. While this mountain range made it difficult for the Umayyad armies to enter Frankish territory, it wouldn't stop them. The Umayyads aimed to extend their influence into what is now France. With this goal in mind, they prepared a large army and began to move northward to confront Charlemagne. This campaign north of the Pyrenees became the backdrop for some unforgettable battles in history. The Umayyads fought fiercely to capture this region and gain superiority over the Frankish kingdom. However, the process turned out to be more challenging than they had anticipated. The Franks had established strong defensive lines north of the Pyrenees and offered stiff resistance to the Umayyad forces. The two great powers faced each other in this strategic part of the Iberian Peninsula. On the battlefield, it wasn't just swords and shields clashing. Two great cultures and civilizations were also challenging one another. Charlemagne dispatched a massive army against the Umayyads. This army was composed of the finest troops of the Franks and aimed to halt the Umayyads' northern advance. However, the Umayyads particularly stood out with their mastery of battle strategies. The military techniques developed in the Islamic world at that time, especially the rapid and effective maneuvers of cavalry, provided a significant advantage against the Frankish armies. The Umayyad superiority manifested itself on multiple fronts. But it must be noted that wars are won not only by the sharpness of swords but also by the intelligence and military genius of the leaders. The Umayyad commanders displayed not just physical strength but also diplomacy and strategic skills in these battles. Nevertheless, the conflicts with the Franks proved exhausting for both sides. The Pyrenees remained a boundary line, while the Umayyads couldn't fully dominate Frankish territory to the north. These clashes showcased their military strength and melee. The Umayyads achieved victories in their ongoing struggles with the Franks, but also realized just how challenging it was to push beyond the Pyrenees. The Pyrenees would remain a de facto boundary between the Umayyads and the Franks. These great battles and victories further solidified the military strength and courage of the Umayyads in Al-Andalus. After suppressing the internal rebellions, their success against external threats boosted the state's power and prestige. These struggles contributed to the strong foundation upon which the Umayyad state in Al-Andalus was built. Al-Andalus was no longer just a state but was emerging as a regional power that could control both its internal population and external threats. Yes, my dear listeners, the great struggles that the Umayyads faced against internal and external threats earned them a place in history in golden letters. Every battle, every victory was a part of their fight for existence. Al-Andalus grew stronger by learning to cope with these threats, becoming a regional power. However, the battles fought on these lands were far from over. The fate of Al-Andalus would be shaped by future great leaders, and this ancient land would witness many more wars, victories, and stories. Ah, dear listeners, let me take you to perhaps the most magnificent period in the history of Andalusia, once shaped by migrations from the Arabian Peninsula. These lands were no longer just a region but were becoming the shining star of the entire Islamic world. The power of the Umayyads in Andalusia had reached its peak after overcoming the tough struggles of its early years. Yet at the top of this rise was a ruler who carved his name in history with golden letters: Abd al-Rahman I. He wasn't just a powerful ruler, he was a leader who would leave his mark on Andalusia's golden age. Abd al-Rahman I was one of the most glorious rulers of the Umayyad dynasty. During his reign, Andalusia reached its peak not only militarily and politically but also economically and culturally. More importantly, he became the first ruler to declare the caliphate in Andalusia. This event was a significant turning point, not only for Andalusian history but for the entire Islamic world. Until then, the caliphate was held by the Abbasid dynasty. However, Abd al-Rahman declared himself caliph to challenge the Abbasids and announce Andalusia's independence and power to the entire Islamic world. This bold move not only gave him political superiority but also turned Andalusia into a respected and powerful center in the Islamic world. So why did Abd al-Rahman I declare the caliphate? At that time, the Abbasid Caliphate still held significant influence in much of the Islamic world, but it was weakening. The power vacuum in the east set the stage for Abd al-Rahman to take this step. Now, Andalusia was a state determining its own destiny, and with this new title, it was not only going to be a military power, but also a religious authority. This provided Abd al-Rahman with great legitimacy, especially in the struggles against the Christian kingdoms in the north. He was no longer just an emir, but the most powerful leader in the Western Islamic world as a caliph. The caliphate title allowed Abd al-Rahman to elevate Andalusia to a much more prestigious and powerful position in the eyes of the Islamic world. With Abd al-Rahman I's caliphate, Andalusia reached the zenith of its military strength. During his reign, the armies of Andalusia became disciplined, powerful, and exceptionally well equipped. Not only the land forces but also the naval forces saw significant development. It was during these years that the Umayyad navy dominated the Mediterranean. The major port cities of Andalusia became strongholds of maritime trade and military power. As Umayyad banners fluttered in the blue waters of the Mediterranean, enemies realized how difficult it was to contend with Andalusia's naval strength. Politically, during Abd al-Rahman I's reign, Andalusia overcame internal turmoil and firmly established a central authority. The internal rebellions and tribal conflicts that previous rulers faced were brought to an end through Abd al-Rahman's wise governance. By this time, everyone recognized Abd al-Rahman's authority and remained loyally devoted to him. This political stability in Andalusia allowed the state to progress under stronger and more effective governance. Although there were occasional conflicts with the Christian kingdoms to the north, Abd al-Rahman successfully dealt with these threats. Andalusia protected its borders and even made some military attempts to expand. However, perhaps the greatest achievement of his reign was maintaining unity within the state and presenting a strong stance against its enemies. Economically, the Umayyad state of Andalusia reached the peak of wealth during this period. Agriculture, trade, and crafts flourished throughout the country. With Abd al-Rahman's rise to power, the nation's infrastructure underwent a major leap. Agricultural lands were made productive with irrigation channels which raised the standard of living for the people. At the same time, through maritime trade, Andalusia became a bridge between the east and west, controlling the most significant trade routes in the Mediterranean. Goods like silk, spices, precious stones, and gold passed through Andalusian ports on their way to Europe and Africa. The vibrancy of trade filled the state treasury, and the cities of Andalusia began to shine with wealth. The magnificent structures built by Abd al-Rahman I were among the most important indicators of the grandeur of that period. The capital, Cordoba, had become one of the largest and most advanced cities in the Islamic world. The palaces, mosques, and bridges constructed during Abd al-Rahman's time became jewels not only for Andalusia, but for the entire Islamic world. Under his reign, Cordoba developed into not just a political and military center, but also a cultural and scientific hub. During this time, libraries housing thousands of manuscripts were established in Cordoba. The most important scholars, philosophers, and artists of the Islamic world gathered there. Abd al-Rahman I placed great importance on science and art, inviting scholars to his palace and supporting their work. This period saw Cordoba become one of the most enlightened cities in the world. Dear friends, the Caliphate of Abd al-Rahman I was a time that brought Andalusia to the pinnacle in every sense. Thanks to his leadership, Andalusia became a strong state respected in both the Islamic world and Europe. However, every rise has an end. This brilliant era, too, would fade with the unforgiving gears of history over time. Yet the legacy left by Abd al-Rahman I was never forgotten and continues to live on today as a legend echoing through the streets of Cordoba. Cordoba, that magnificent city, the shining star of Islamic civilization in the West. Now close your eyes and imagine Cordoba in those times. a city filled with wide streets where knowledge, art, and architecture thrived at every corner. It wasn't just a city, it was the heart of a civilization. However, the Cordoba we know today didn't come about overnight. Over the centuries, especially during the reign of Abd-al-Rahman I and his successor al-Hakam I, Cordoba transformed into a world capital not just politically, but also culturally and scientifically. After declaring his caliphate, Abd-al-Rahman I didn't just turn Cordoba into a military base, he decided to make it the heart of all of Al-Andalus. It needed to be built up as a center of culture, science, and art, not just a government hub. Abd-al-Rahman took significant steps to strengthen the capital. He constructed palaces, villas, and libraries. These buildings not only enhanced the architectural beauty of the city, but also turned Cordoba into a major attraction. Scholars, poets, and artists flocked to this city, not just from Al-Andalus, but from all corners of the Islamic world. Imagine in these palaces and libraries, scientists from around the world were gathering to work on various fields, from astronomy to medicine, and mathematics to philosophy. Science was experiencing a golden age in Cordoba. Major astronomical works were written here, and the most advanced medical knowledge of the time was developed in this city. Abd-al-Rahman's vision of making Cordoba a cultural hub spread this wealth of knowledge throughout Al-Andalus. In the grand libraries of the city, hundreds of thousands of books were being crafted by countless scholars. According to legends, the number of books in Cordoba surpassed the total found in all the libraries of Europe at that time. This cultural capital that Abd-al-Rahman built became a legacy not just for the Islamic world, but for all of humanity. But the great developments in Cordoba weren't limited to just science and literature. Architecture was one of the key elements reflecting the soul of the city. Abd-al-Rahman and his successors embarked on significant construction projects to beautify and strengthen the city. The Great Mosque of Cordoba was one of the most magnificent structures built during this period. The expansive courtyard, elegant columns, and stunning mihrab of the mosque became one of the most beautiful examples of Islamic architecture. The peaceful atmosphere inside the mosque was not just a place of worship, it was a structure reflecting the pinnacle of art and craftsmanship. This mosque was the most tangible evidence of Abd-al-Rahman's desire to make Cordoba the cultural and scientific center of the Islamic world. So, how did Cordoba transform into a capital of science and culture in such a short time? The answer lies in Abd-al-Rahman's wise and forward-thinking governance. He wasn't just a political leader, he understood very well how culture and science could advance society as a statesman. Therefore, he placed great value on scientists and artists. He hosted thinkers, scholars, and artists from different countries in his palace. He didn't just provide them shelter and protection, he also financed their work. Thus, Cordoba quickly became an attraction center. These scholars coming from across the Islamic world only enhanced Cordoba's reputation. The city was now recognized as a center of knowledge and culture, not just in Al-Andalus, but throughout the entire Islamic world. Of course, these developments in Cordoba weren't limited to Abd-al-Rahman's efforts. His successor, al-Hakam I, continued the same vision and pushed the city even further. Al-Hakam placed great importance on libraries. During his reign, Cordoba became famous for its libraries. These libraries, filled with hundreds of manuscripts at every corner, were accessible not only to scholars but to the public as well. This access to knowledge led to a generally high education level in Al-Andalus society. The libraries built by al-Hakam became one of the greatest treasures of knowledge in the Islamic world. Every street in Cordoba was like a boulevard of knowledge, and the people thrived with this closeness to science and art. But remember, Cordoba was not just a center of science and culture, it was also a hub of great political achievements. The city maintained its position as the capital of the Umayyad Caliphate of Al-Andalus, continuing to be a center of political power. The strong governance structure that Abd-al-Rahman built was upheld by his successors, keeping Cordoba safe from external threats. While there were minor rebellions across Al-Andalus during this time, Abd-al-Rahman and al-Hakam swiftly suppressed them to reinforce central authority. And of course, the power of the Umayyads of Al-Andalus was not limited to Cordoba. The city's wealth and cultural heritage spread throughout the Mediterranean. Through maritime trade, Al-Andalus interacted with other civilizations not just economically but culturally as well. These trade routes facilitated the exchange of knowledge between the Eastern and Western worlds. The scientific discoveries and artistic creations developed in Cordoba eventually reached Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East. In this way, Al-Andalus played an essential role in shaping not just the Islamic world but the history of the entire globe. My dear friends, Cordoba was not just a city. It became a symbol of knowledge, art, culture, and political power. Thanks to the vision of leaders like al-Rahman I, and al-Hakam I, Cordoba remained a shining star not just in its own time, but throughout all of history. Even today, as you walk through the streets of Cordoba, you can feel the traces of that golden age, and in every stone, in every corner, you can sense the deep breath of history. This city is a shared heritage of not only the Umayyads, but of all humanity. My dear listeners, let me take you back centuries to the cool winds of northern Iberia, to those complex and dangerous lands. These lands were where the Umayyads were trying to expand Andalusia, but they were met with strong enemies that stood firm like hard rocks. One of those tough opponents was the Franks. They were a challenging enemy, both militarily and politically. But this struggle wasn't just a simple battle between two armies. No, it was much more than that. These wars were strategic chess moves that shaped the future of two civilizations, the fate of Europe and the spread of Islam in the West. The battles between the Franks and the Umayyads continued for years, filled with ups and downs, victories and defeats. After conquering the Iberian Peninsula, the Umayyad Caliphate set its sights northward towards Frankish lands. Their goal wasn't just to expand territory, but also to deepen the roots of Islamic civilization, these new lands. However, the Franks were not an easy target. Their leader, Charles Martel, was one of the most powerful commanders of the times. He was intelligent, brave, and a master strategist. These two great powers were heading toward one of the most significant conflicts in history. As the armies of Andalusia advanced into Frankish territory, it was essential to understand that these campaigns were not just conquests. The Umayyads aimed to control both strategic and trade routes. This push into northern Europe also meant expanding their dominance over the Mediterranean. However, this grand ambition met a solid wall in Frankish lands. This wall culminated in the Great Clash at Tours in 732. The Battle of Tours, it's an event etched into the dusty pages of history. On that day, the armies of Andalusia had marched north, penetrating deep into France. The Franks, determined to stop this advance, gathered all their strength. Under Charles Martel's command, the Frankish army confronted the Andalusian forces on the cold morning of Tours. My dear friends, this battle was not just a skirmish, it was a turning point that would determine the future of Europe. The Andalusian army was strong, known for its famous cavalry. They could defeat their enemies with quick and agile movements. But that day, in the vast plains of Tours, the Franks had a different strategy. Charles Martel established a defensive line against the cavalry charges and kept his soldiers tightly grouped. No matter how powerful the Andalusian cavalry's attacks were, they couldn't break through this wall. In the days of conflict that followed, the Andalusian forces suffered significant losses. Ultimately, Charles Martel declared victory. Thus, Tours became not just a battle, but a pivotal moment that marked the end of the Umayyads' northern advance. This victory had immense significance, not just for the Franks, but for all of Europe. After the Battle of Tours, the spread of Islam in Europe was largely halted. The Umayyads had to give up their dreams of expansion to the north. The Franks viewed this victory as a unifying force for Europe. The Frankish kingdom grew stronger after this win and became a political power center in Western Europe. Those descended from Charles Martel, including Charlemagne, would carry this power further. But one thing must not be forgotten. This war was not merely a victory or defeat. It symbolized the struggle between civilizations. Of course, Andalusia did not stop after this defeat. It remained strong on the Iberian Peninsula. However, this loss forced them to abandon their northern expansion strategy. In the following years, the Umayyads focused on their southern territories, trying to establish a robust state structure within Andalusia. Yet the impact of Tours was not only military but also deeply psychological. The Andalusian army never launched such a large-scale northern campaign again. The Franks, with this victory, began to be seen as the protectors of Europe. My dear friends, when looking back at this period in history, we must not only consider the wars and victories but also how these events shaped human history. The Battle of Tours stopped the Andalusian expansion, but it also reshaped the political balances in Europe. That day, the victory of the Frankish army possibly prevented the Islamic civilization from gaining a more substantial foothold in Europe. However, during this period, the Umayyads continued to exist in the Iberian Peninsula and evolved within their own realm. And so, my dear listeners, from that cold morning in Tours to today, this war has echoed as a lesson for both the Franks and the Umayyads. Strategic victories are not only about gaining territory, they also shape the futures of civilizations. And although these struggles may be lost in the deep waters of history, we can still feel the echoes of that era today. My dear listeners, isn't history such a strange cycle? One moment, those great powers are at their peak. and the next they start to rot from within. Today I'm going to tell you how the caliphate weakened through its internal struggles, and how that mighty Umayyad power was slowly brought to ruin. As we turn the pages of time, we'll see that this decline wasn't just due to external enemies, but also because of divisions within. The internal conflicts had begun to shake the great Umayyad Caliphate. For many years, the Umayyad dynasty had held the leadership of the Islamic world. Before the Abbasid revolution, they ruled over a vast territory, reaching all the way to the Iberian Peninsula in the west. But no matter how strong they were, like every great empire, they had their weaknesses. The central authority that had been established in the early years of the caliphate started to erode over time, especially the power struggles within the dynasty, the governors acting independently in the provinces, and the ongoing political conflicts deeply affected Umayyad rule. The greatest of these internal struggles came during the period known as the Fitna. The first sparks of this era were ignited by the power struggle within the Umayyad Caliphate. Like every great empire, the Umayyads began to crack from within. The Caliphate was not just a symbol of leadership in the Islamic world, it represented immense power and wealth as well. Because of this, each ruler fought to hold on to this power. Family rivalries, bloody battles between brothers and cousins, and revolts erupting all around the Islamic lands began to weaken the Caliphate. In the later years of the Umayyad Caliphate, these internal conflicts intensified. The central authority was growing weaker. Governors started to act almost independently, making decisions without regard for the central authority. But even worse, the competition for the caliphal throne created complete chaos within the country. Caliphs were deposed one after another. Assassinations became commonplace, and it was hard to tell who was a friend and who was an enemy. This atmosphere of confusion created unrest not only among the rulers but also among the common people. During the Fitna period, these conflicts turned into civil war. Fitna in Arabic means division or fragmentation, and this period perfectly illustrates that, a massive split among Muslims. The civil wars that broke out in the last years of the Umayyad Caliphate affected not only the dynasty but the entire Islamic world. Brothers fought against brothers, and governors revolted against caliphs. While struggles for the caliphal position continued, the common people were crushed under the weight of these conflicts. These civil wars not only made the question of who would hold the throne uncertain, but they also jeopardized the future of the Islamic world. Although the Umayyads ruled over a vast area, these internal conflicts began to erode their authority. The caliphate, weakened by internal struggles, could no longer maintain as strong a central authority as before. Governors acted almost independently in their provinces, trying to increase their own power. Rebellions grew and new enemies appeared at every corner. This chaotic period slowly laid the groundwork for the collapse of the Umayyad Caliphate. Internal feuds, struggles for the throne, revolts, and public discontent caused this great empire to rot from within. This once powerful dynasty had now fractured within itself. Caliphs could no longer protect their authority, and the Islamic world stood on the brink of fragmentation. It was at this point that the Abbasid movement emerged. The Abbasids took advantage of this internal chaos to achieve victory over the Umayyads, toppling the Umayyad dynasty in 750. But this revolution was not just a change for the Umayyads, it was a pivotal event that altered the fate of the entire Islamic world. My dear friends, we can clearly see how even the greatest powers in history can be brought to ruin by internal struggles. No matter how significant external threats are, what truly brings down an empire are conflicts and divisions from within. The Umayyads are one of the most striking examples of this. Once unifying the Islamic world, this great dynasty crumbled because of its internal battles and paved the way for the Abbasids. However, this collapse held significant lessons for the history of the Islamic world. These internal struggles didn't just change a dynasty, they fundamentally transformed the political landscape of the Islamic world. The Fitna period created deep divisions among Muslims, and these rifts continued to resonate for centuries. Thus, my dear friends, the magnificent rise of the Umayyad Caliphate came to an end through civil wars and struggles. This dynasty, once the most powerful state in the Islamic world, faded into the dusty pages of history. Yet, the traces they left behind still invite us to think and learn lessons today. My dear listeners, this is how the Umayyads weakened and collapsed. While bringing the events to life, I want to remind you once again how this great dynasty slowly vanished into the depths of history due to its internal conflicts. Remember, what leads to the downfall of great powers in history isn't just external enemies, but also divisions and struggles from within. And the Umayyads are the greatest example of this painful truth. My dear listeners, one must take a deep breath to recount the chaos that unfolded in Al-Andalus after the caliphate fell, because now we're diving into the story of the small yet ambitious kingdoms known as the Taifas that arose from the shadow of a powerful empire. The collapse of the Umayyad Caliphate didn't just plunge the lands of Al-Andalus into uncertainty, it also opened the door to a period of strife among various small emirates, each trying to assert its own power. The Iberian Peninsula began to shake like waves on a vast sea. The people, who once bowed their heads, now had to fend for themselves. The vast power of the Caliphate didn't vanish overnight, of course, but over time the central authority weakened due to internal struggles and dynastic disputes, leading to its eventual disintegration. The great Umayyad state, founded by Abd al-Rahman, had gained strength through rulers who carried the Caliphate's banner. Unfortunately, his descendants couldn't maintain the same solid foundations. Civil wars, battles for the throne, and constant conflicts eroded the power of the central authority in the eyes of the people. With the Caliphate's end, there was no longer a single dominant power in these lands. In the era of independent small kingdoms, the taifas had begun. These taifas became the symbol of political fragmentation in Al-Andalus. Each was constantly engaged in struggle to defend and even expand its own territory. If you had lived in that time, you would have seen different flags and rulers at every turn. In Cordoba, there was one emir, in Seville another, and in Valencia, a completely different family ruled. Each taifa defended its region like a fortress, striving to gain supremacy over the others. But dear friends, peace was a rare guest among these power-hungry little states. Instead, there were intrigues, alliances, betrayals, and wars all over this land. When thinking about this period in Al-Andalus, the first thing that may come to mind is perhaps the endless conflicts. Each taifa was fighting against the others to preserve its independence and power. Now close your eyes and imagine every morning a different village or city is under siege and the people are living in fear. The battles for the throne never cease. Borders are constantly shifting and once wealthy cities turn to ruins. Yes, the era of the taifas was just like that. One ruler would attack his neighbor to strengthen his own power, while another taifa would ally with a different enemy just to survive. This web of complex relationships laid the groundwork for the unending wars that engulfed Al-Andalus. However, there's another important point I need to highlight, dear friends. The period of the taifas wasn't just filled with bloody wars. Despite the deep political rivalries among these small emirates, there was also a vibrant cultural and economic life. Each taifa was trying to establish a center of art, science, and trade within its territory. Cities like Cordoba, Seville, and Granada had become cultural capitals. They welcomed scholars, philosophers, and poets in their courts, preserving the great intellectual heritage of the Islamic world. Yet, sadly, these cultural advancements couldn't quell the political chaos among the taifas. The wars between the taifas didn't just tear Al-Andalus apart, they also presented a significant opportunity for the Christian kingdoms on the Iberian Peninsula. The northern Christian kingdoms, which once resisted the Islamic armies, knew how to take advantage of this division. Gradually, they increased their strength and began to expand into Al-Andalus. Each of them watched the Muslim kingdoms' conflicts, waiting for the right moment. Particularly, the Christian kingdoms of Castile, Leon, and Aragon capitalized on the fragmentation among the taifas and advanced deeper into Al-Andalus. Once the conquerors, Al-Andalus now found itself on the defensive. This political chaos became one of the biggest factors that led to the end of Al-Andalus. The weak and divided taifas struggled to unite against external threats. These small kingdoms fighting amongst themselves couldn't establish a common defense against incoming attacks. With the rise of the Reconquista movement, the Christian kingdoms began gradually reclaiming Al-Andalus. With every victory, they grew bolder, taking advantage of the hostilities between the taifas. Dear friends, this historical period teaches us once again that internal strife and division can lead even the strongest empires to destruction. While the taifas were constantly battling each other, they ignored the great danger from outside. Their conflicts weakened them, and ultimately the Muslim dominance in the Iberian Peninsula slowly eroded in the face of the advancing Christian kingdoms. Yet, no matter what happened, the cultural legacy this period left on the history of Al-Andalus is still remembered. The architecture, art, and science developed by each taifa reflect the intellectual heritage of the Islamic world at that time. Unfortunately, even these great cultural riches couldn't save them from political and military chaos. The period of the taifas was both an age of scientific and cultural development, and a time filled with political turmoil and wars. In the end, the internal struggles of these small states led to the gradual demise of Islamic rule in Al-Andalus. So, my dear listeners, this is the story of the great chaos in Al-Andalus. The wars between the taifas and the paved, these small emirates that emerged after the fall of the great Umayyad Caliphate, were preparing their own demise while battling each other. Remember, history always offers us great lessons. One of these lessons is that internal strife and division can spell the end for a society. The Taifas period is one of the clearest examples of this truth. My dear listeners, I'm going to take you back to the dark days of Andalusia, when the Christian kingdoms relentlessly advanced against Muslim-held territories. This wasn't just a period of battles with swords clashing, it was also an era marked by the clash of beliefs, ideals, and the struggle for power. Remember, the internal conflicts between the Taifas had weakened Andalusia. While each tried to protect their little throne, a great enemy was waiting impatiently at the gates. As we approached the year 1085, the Christian advance in Andalusia was picking up speed, and it couldn't be ignored any longer. The Christian kingdoms in the north had been preparing to reclaim these lands for quite some time. What they called the Reconquista was essentially a holy war for them. Reclaiming the territory and taking Andalusia from Muslim control was a common goal for the Christian world, and they were about to achieve one of their greatest victories with the fall of Toledo. Toledo, once one of the most important cities of Muslim Andalusia, a center of knowledge and culture. This city was where ancient wisdom flourished and Muslims, Christians, and Jews lived together. But those days were long gone. Toledo was a major strategic target in the eyes of the Christians, and this target would eventually fall into the hands of King Alfonso VI of Castile. The year 1085, etched in history as the year of Toledo's fall, was a true turning point for Muslim Andalusia. Alfonso VI had skillfully exploited the disputes among the Taifas, assessing each of their weaknesses. Even though the Muslim kings were aware of the danger from the north, their internal conflicts prevented them from uniting. The fall of Toledo was not just a major victory for the Christian kingdoms, it was also the moment when the fate of Andalusia began to be sealed. With this victory, the Christian kingdoms were emboldened and the Reconquista movement gained momentum. The Christian armies, advancing from the north toward Muslim territories in the south, were now determined to seize these lands one by one. At this point, my dear friends, think about it. The fall of Toledo was not just a military victory. It was a turning point for Muslim Andalusia. This city, once the heart of knowledge and civilization, was now under the control of the Christian armies. With the fall of Toledo, Muslims became even weaker in Andalusia. This was not just the collapse of a political power, but also of a civilization. As the Christians announced their conquest of Toledo to Europe, the event demonstrated that Muslim Andalusia could not mount significant resistance, boosting the morale of other Christian kingdoms. A great hope for Christian dominance in these lands had now emerged. The fall of Toledo was not only a military victory, but also a pivotal moment in the Reconquista. After this event, the Christian advance began to accelerate. All across the Iberian Peninsula, the Christian kingdoms capitalized on this victory. The Christian armies moving toward the southern Muslim territories were preparing for battles that would ultimately end Andalusia. However, the loss of Toledo did not completely extinguish Muslim resistance. This significant defeat deeply shook the Muslims in Andalusia and showed them that they needed to regroup. After the fall of Toledo, the remaining Muslim leaders in Andalusia sought alliances to combat this danger. They looked for ways to get external help, especially turning to powerful Muslim states in Africa. A new defense line needed to be established in these lands. But dear friends, unfortunately, it was already too late. The loss of Toledo had broken the northern defense line of Andalusia. While Muslims were fighting among themselves, the enemy was steadily approaching their door. The Christian kingdoms grew stronger with each new victory. The Reconquista had now become not just a goal, but a matter of faith. And this struggle for faith would bring about the end of Muslim Andalusia. So, my dear friends, this great and painful period marked the slow end of the golden age of Muslim Andalusia. The process that began with the loss of Toledo, combined with the determined advance of the Christian kingdoms, had led Muslim Andalusia down an irreversible path. My dear friends, as the glorious days of the Umayyads in Andalusia, their magnificent cities and their shining civilizations slowly faded into the shadows of history, these lands were starting to shake not only from internal strife but also from external threats. Yes, as the Christian kingdoms ramped up their Reconquista efforts from the north, the weakening structure of Andalusia found it increasingly difficult to resist these attacks. But every collapse brings about a struggle for revival, doesn't it? During this time, the desperate Muslim leaders of Andalusia once again turned their hopes across the seas to North Africa. When the Umayyad Caliphate, which had once thrived in Andalusia, fell, it left behind political vacuums, internal chaos, and fragmented small kingdoms known as the Taifas. Each of these little states ruled independently, fighting amongst themselves and constantly scheming to gain power. However, day by day they were facing the advancing Christians. At that time, everyone in Andalusia was saying one thing: they couldn't handle this struggle alone. That's why they turned their eyes to the Murabids, who had strong and disciplined armies in Africa. The Murabids, my friends, they were no ordinary army. They were tough, determined warriors forged in the harsh deserts of North Africa. This military order, which placed loyalty to its leader above all else, had achieved great conquests in Africa through discipline and faith. When the Taifas sought help from the Murabids to resist the Christian advance, they turned to such a powerful force. They invited them to these lands to stop the Christian armies. By the year 1086, the Murabit leader Yusuf ibn Tashfin set foot in Andalusia. This army, crossing the sea on hundreds of ships, became a breath of fresh air for the weakened structure of Andalusia. Once divided and weakened, Muslim Andalusia was now preparing to unite and resist once again under Yusuf ibn Tashfin's leadership. With his arrival, the Muslims achieved a significant victory over the Christian kingdoms. The Muslims in Andalusia regained hope with the arrival of the Murabids and managed to halt the Christian advance for a while. However, dear friends, every military intervention goes beyond just facing external threats. The Murabids became not only a military force but also a political authority in Andalusia. Yusuf ibn Tashfin did not just defend Andalusia amidst the chaos. He also eliminated the Taifas one by one, bringing these lands under his control. Now Andalusia was part of the Murabit realm. This North African power managed to hold Andalusia together for a time. But like every great empire, their rise would eventually lead to a fall. The powerful armies and political authority of the Murabids brought some peace to Andalusia for a while. Sadly, that peace didn't last long. Over time, the Murabids' rigid governance led to discontent among the local people in Andalusia. This discontent ushered in another North African power onto the historical stage, the Almohads. The Almohads, my friends, their arrival was a reaction to the Murabit strict governing style. They viewed themselves as possessing a purer, stricter Islamic understanding than the Murabids. When the Almohads stepped into Andalusian in the early 12th century, they replaced the Murabids and strengthened their Muslim dominance once then. Just like the Murabids, they also tried to defend the lands of Andalusia. However, the Almohad rule was more rigid and centralized compared to the Murabids, creating new tensions among the people of Andalusia. Compared to the Murabids, the Almohads were somewhat more effective against the Christian kingdoms. And during their time, the defense of Amausa was once again bolstered. However, despite their strength, internal conflicts and strategic mistakes ultimately mistakes. The famous Battle of Las Navas de Tolosa in 1212 marked one of their greatest defeats against the Christians. This battle not only signaled the end of the Almohads, but also marked the beginning of the collapse of Muslim Andalusia. My dear friends, the Murabids and the Almohads, these two great powers from North Africa fought fiercely to defend Andalusia and keep the Muslims united. But internal strife, public discontent, and the determined advance of the Christian kingdoms changed their fate as well. Once great warriors who came from across the seas, they became beacons of hope during the dark and difficult days of Andalusia. Unfortunately, like many others, they too gradually faded from the historical scene. Andalusia witnessed tremendous struggles during both the Murabit and Almohad periods. The arrival of these two North African powers might have temporarily halted the collapse of Andalusia. But my friends, the flow of history cannot be stopped, no matter how powerful every empire is its end. My dear friends, the once shining star of Andalusia was slowly beginning to fade. Those glorious days when science and art, culture and architecture reached their peak were now living only in memories. In the face of the relentless and brutal advance of the Christian kingdoms, Muslim Andalusia began to shrink little by little. The heirs of the Umayyad Caliphate, who once ruled vast lands, were now struggling to survive in a shrinking and constricting territory. But history, my dear friends, continued to flow without pause. Each loss drove a deeper pain into the hearts of the Muslims. This process began with the capture of Toledo by the Christians in 1085, and it had become unstoppable. Muslim dominance in Andalusia was gradually weakening, cities were falling one by one, and foreign cultures from across the shores were infiltrating the spirit of Andalusia. This retreat, which lasted for centuries, was not just a loss of land but also the slow burial of a civilization in the darkness of history. The last remaining stronghold, Granada, my friends, this glorious city had become the final fortress, the last stand of Muslim Andalusia. By the mid-13th century, the Emirate of Granada was the only independent region left in Andalusia under Muslim control. The splendor of the Alhambra, the lively sounds echoing through the narrow streets of Granada, that magical atmosphere, was perhaps a last glimmer of hope. But the Christian kingdoms continued their relentless advance. Granada, especially during the Nasrid dynasty, put up great resistance. This last refuge for Muslims had become a political and cultural center. The magnificent architecture of the Alhambra Palace sparkled like a jewel at the heart of the city. But alas, my dear friends, history would be merciless to this magnificent city as well. By 1492, Granada was struggling to exist under the shadow of the Christian kings. The Spanish monarchy, strengthened by the unification of the crowns of Aragon and Castile, had set out to completely eliminate Muslim Andalusia. And then came that final day. That unforgettable day, on January 2nd, 1492, the last emir of Granada, Boabdil, realized he couldn't stand against the armies of Ferdinand and Isabella. The time had come to say goodbye. As he surrendered the city, tears streamed down his face. Historians tell of how Boabdil turned back for one last sorrowful look as he left the Alhambra. That moment is known as El Suspiro del Moro, or the last sigh of the Moor. Because this wasn't just Boabdil's last breath, it was the last breath of a civilization. With the fall of Granada, the legacy of the Umayyads in Andalusia faded into history. This great civilization succumbed to the unending pressure of the Christian Reconquista. But this was not just a loss of land. The fall of Andalusia marked a significant breaking point for the Muslim world. These lands, where science, art, architecture, tolerance, and diverse cultures coexisted, would now remain only as memories in the pages of history. However, my dear friends, you know that even if a civilization disappears, it leaves traces behind. The legacy of Andalusia resonated not only in Spain but around the world. Following the fall of Granada, many Muslims and Jews were forced to leave Spain, but these cultures carried the science, art, and spirit of Andalusia to the places they went. This legacy spread to North Africa and the Ottoman territories, allowing the influence of Andalusia to be felt for centuries. So, my dear friends, while it may seem that the fall of Granada closed the doors of Andalusia, its light continued to shine in other lands. Today we remember Andalusia not just as a piece of history, but for the values it contributed to human civilization. The end of Granada marked the close of an era, but it was also the beginning of a legacy that would endure into eternity. My dear friends, as time flows like water, we've witnessed the captivating and bittersweet history of Andalusia. Every corner of this land, every stone, every remnant, carry stories whispering to us from the depths of history. And now, as we share those stories with you, we approach the end of this unforgettable journey. What a great civilization. What an epic tale. Just think about it. For centuries, a brilliant civilization that became a hub for scientists, artists, and philosophers from all over the world. Those magnificent palaces, the music echoing through the streets, the calls to prayer rising in the air. This was a land where Muslims, Jews, and Christians lived together. It was a source of knowledge, tolerance, and creativity. But like every great civilization, Andalusia eventually succumbed to the flow of history. However, no matter how devastated it may be, the marks it left behind are still alive today. The spirit of Andalusia continues to thrive in those ancient cities. In the shadows of its glorious structures, its influence is felt not only in Spain but across the globe. And you should know, dear friends, that history is not just something that belongs to the past. Every story, every event teaches us something today. Andalusia showed us the value of tolerance, science, and art. It proved how different cultures can achieve great things together in peace. Our duty is to remember this legacy and draw inspiration from it to create a better world. And so we've come to the end of our long journey through the rich history of Andalusia. But know that this is not just an ending. Every ending brings a new beginning. While one door closes, another one opens. You too will carry this knowledge and these stories with you as you continue your own journey. Perhaps one day you'll visit these lands, wander through those ancient streets, and breathe in the scent of history in the shadow of the Alhambra. At that moment, your stories will echo among those stones. Now, dear friends, it's time to slowly say goodbye. But don't forget, history is our shared heritage. The people of the past experienced emotions just like us. They felt joy, tasted sorrow, and nurtured hopes. Their stories continue to guide us even today. It has been a great joy for me to share this journey with you. Whenever you feel curious about history or wish to perhaps through recalls magical moments from the past, we can always gather around this fire and return to our stories. Now it's time to part ways. but know that we will meet again in other adventures hidden in the depths of history. Farewell, my dear friends. And remember, history always lives on with us in our hearts, in our minds, and in our souls.